I always thought my uncle was just a little off, but not in a dangerous way, more like eccentric. He had this weird obsession with family history, and he was always asking for things like a strand of hair or a used napkin to preserve family memories. I was a teenager back then, and I just thought he was one of those quirky relatives we all have. But then, things started getting much darker. It all started with small, innocent things. I'd notice my hairbrush was missing after a visit, or a shirt I'd left in the laundry would somehow end up in his bag when he left. He always had an excuse, like he accidentally packed it, or was just helping out with the laundry. I didn't think much of it until the dreams began. The dreams were vivid, such me standing alone in a dark room with my uncle's voice whispering things I couldn't understand. I'd wake up feeling like someone was watching me, and sometimes I'd find a strange mark on my skin, a faint symbol, almost like a bruise, but in a shape that was too defined to be accidental. That's when I started paying closer attention. One day, I visited my uncle's house. I was supposed to be helping him organize some old boxes in the basement, but what I found there was beyond anything I could have imagined. On one of the shelves, I noticed a row of jars, jars filled with hair, fingernails, and other personal things. Some of them even had small pieces of cloth, like the kind you'd get from an old shirt, my shirt. Each jar had a name written on it, and mine was there too. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He had been collecting these things for years, not just from me, but from every family member. And the jars weren't just labeled with names, they had symbols drawn on them, symbols that matched the strange marks I'd seen in my dreams. That night, I decided to confront him. I thought maybe he was just delusional, but when I asked him about the jars, he didn't even try to deny it. Instead, he looked at me with a strange, calm expression. He said, "It's for protection, for all of us." His tone was gentle, almost comforting, but there was something in his eyes that sent chills down my spine. I felt like I was talking to someone possessed by a dark purpose. I tried to tell my parents, but they brushed it off as a misunderstanding, just like always. They thought I was overreacting. "That's just Uncle Tom," they said, as if collecting body parts from family members was perfectly normal. But I couldn't let it go. I started doing my own research, and what I found was horrifying. The symbols on the jars were part of something called the binding rite. It's an ancient form of black magic that involves using personal items to bind someone's soul, essentially gaining control over them. The jars weren't for protection, they were for manipulation. The more he collected, the stronger his power would be over each person. And the worst part? I realized that the more he protected me, the more my life seemed to spiral out of control. Relationships failed, I became paranoid, and I felt like I was constantly under a dark cloud. I knew I had to do something. So one night, I snuck into my uncle's basement. The house was dead silent, except for the faint sound of a clock ticking somewhere in the darkness. I found the jars, one by one, and started smashing them. But as I did, I heard a voice from behind me. It was my uncle, and he wasn't alone. He stood there, chanting softly, with an almost serene smile on his face, as if he'd expected me all along. I froze. His eyes were locked on mine, and for a moment I felt like I couldn't move. My limbs felt heavy, my mind clouded. He took a step closer, still chanting, and I could feel this overwhelming pressure in my chest, like something was trying to force its way inside me. But then, as if by some miracle, I managed to break free. I smashed the last jar with my name on it, and suddenly, the room felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted. I ran out of that house as fast as I could. I could still hear his voice behind me, calling my name, but I didn't stop. I never went back, and I told my family that I'd never speak to him again. They still think I'm being dramatic, but I know the truth. I later found out that he had done similar things to other family members, though not everyone had figured it out like I did. Some of them still think he's just eccentric, but I know better. And now, every time I feel a strange mark on my skin or have a sudden nightmare, I wonder if he's still out there, collecting. So if you ever have a family member who's a little too interested in keeping your personal belongings, maybe don't dismiss it as just a quirk, because you never really know what's behind the obsession.